Allies are never permanent. Allies change according to circumstance. In 1894, Japan burst anew into the world's strategic calculations by humbling its giant neighbor, China. The British minister in Tokyo informed London that a strong Japanese navy might constitute a menace not only to Hong Kong and Singapore, but also to the Australian colonies. For Australia, the nightmare of being swamped by Chinese laborers gave way to a new fear, the fear of being overwhelmed by the armed hordes of Japan. The British had no reason to appreciate antipathy and anxiety about imminent Asian invasion. They wanted to see the rapidly modernizing Japan secure within the British Club.
So come into the garden, John, la da 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 da. Come into
In the year of the Sino-Japanese War, the British moved to sign a trade treaty with Japan, broadened in 1902 to the Anglo-Japanese Military Alliance, aimed at an eastward expanding Russian empire.
Both of them have this common enemy in the Tsarist Russians, so they form an alliance, which is an alliance in the Far East. It's not necessarily meant to be an alliance at that stage in Europe or anywhere else, but it's to check the Russian advance across Siberia and down into northern China.
Most Australian colonies had refused to participate in the 1894 trade agreement because it required free Japanese entry. Australians continued to resist imperial efforts to push them towards an accommodation of Japanese migration. But uncomfortable as it may have been, Japan, as an ally of the British Empire, was now also Australia's ally, and would remain so until 1921. It was a relationship not without tension. In 1901, during the Boxer Rebellion, as part of an international force, Japanese and Australian contingents had fought side by side, defending Britain's trade concessions against anti-Western Chinese patriots. And yet, in the same year, the new Federation of Australia passed into law an anti-Asian immigration policy.
The catch-all formula that was adopted in white Australia, I mean the pinko-grey peoples of Australia declaring themselves white and resolving not to permit the immigration of non-pinko-grey peoples into the country, was of course much resented by the Japanese from the beginning. The Japanese had strived from the 1880s. They'd said they're leaving Asia behind. They're no longer an Asian country. They're becoming an advanced civilized country. Civilization, they thought, had nothing to do with race. It had to do with the adoption of standards of civilization and culture, and they made every effort to adopt those. So when they were rebuffed for purely racial reasons, that grated very severely on the Japanese sensibility.
By the time we get to Federation, the concern there is how to keep the Japanese out of Australia without actually offending them. So we don't mind offending the Chinese or the Indians or those people because they can't do anything to us. I mean, we can just tell them to take a jump in whatever their closest sea happens to be. But in relation to the Japanese, we can't afford to offend them because they might give us a slap in the face back.
When the Japanese indignantly complained about being bracketed with uncivilized Chinese or Indians, London, in contrast to Australia, diplomatically moved to accommodate these English of the East by classifying them as honorary whites. Despite racist misgivings, Australia quickly became an important supplier of raw materials to Japan's rapidly expanding industries. Pragmatic exceptions were made to the migration policy. Japanese merchants were allowed in on limited visas. And Japan's big trading houses, dealing mainly in wool, wheat and minerals, were well established in Australia by early in the century. From the 1890s, the Australian pearl shell industry depended on Japanese divers. The Australian attitude towards the Japanese was ambivalent. Raucous contempt was mixed with a respect for thrift, hard work, and commercial initiative. Indeed, these sterling British qualities were given as reasons for limiting their entry. But Japanese-style furniture was welcome. Following the English affectation, Australians had so taken to notions of exotic Japanese interior decoration that, towards the end of the 19th century, fans, drapes, screens, and peacock feathers festooned Australian walls.
Japanese influence in Australian interiors started, as most fashions did, at the top of the scale, economically and socially, and it filtered down, and by the end of the 80s and into the 90s, it had seeped out to the suburbs and penetrated to the very heart of rural Australia and become very debased.
Elements of Anglo-Japanese aestheticism even found their way into the studios and works of Australian Impressionist painters, such as Tom Roberts. And then, in 1904, Japan again demonstrated its awesome military capacity by defeating the superpower Imperial Russia in a major land and sea war. With the Russians held in check, Britain felt able to withdraw some of its naval power from the Pacific.
The naval defence of Australia is effectively handed over to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, for Australia, I mean, these were the major threats. We were, of course, worried about the Russians and the Germans and the French and everybody else, but our principal worry was the person who was now designated by the mother country to look after us, the Japanese.
Keen to see Admiral Tojo's navy remain on the Empire's side, Australia welcomed the renewals of the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1905 and 1911, but also began building a navy of its own. This development was initially rejected by London on the basis that the Empire needed only one navy, the Royal Navy, under one command, London's command. But Australia had begun to doubt Britain's resolve to maintain its Far East fleet at a reassuring level. Looking for another powerful friend, feelers were put out to America. London was infuriated, seeing this as undermining the Anglo-Japanese treaty. Japan was an ally of Britain when war against Germany broke out in 1914.
Now, initially, the Brits don't really want the Japanese to do any more than look after the Germans in China, because there are German occupants in China as well. So they're quite happy for them to take care of them, but there are German possessions all through the Pacific. The Japanese take possession of the ones north of the equator because the British simply can't get the ships around to do it. They stop them at the equator, but they do allow the warships to escort Australian troops to Gallipoli. There's a Japanese warship protecting the Australian fleet.
On the run to Egypt, the Sydney sank the German raider Emden in a celebrated rite of passage for the unblooded Australian Navy. But the Japanese warship Ibuki, twice the size of the Australian, had assumed that the task would go to it and was humiliated when called back by the British commander of the fleet. Throughout the war, the Australian coast was defended by Japanese warships. This was a concern to Prime Minister Billy Hughes, who privately worried that If the war went badly, Japan might change sides. But official goodwill had to be maintained. And when an Australian shore battery found a flimsy excuse to fire at the Japanese cruiser Yahagi as it came into dock, the Australian Governor-General was sent to Perth to apologise personally to the captain.
Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister, goes over to England. The British say to him, well, look, we've got this problem. We've got the problem with our ally, the Japanese. They say to us they want to be friendly with us. We say we want you to be friendly, but we've got this problem that we can't allow them to send land troops in. But as we're running out of troops ourselves, we're going to need more land troops from somewhere. Could perhaps Australia supply them? Well, of course, Australia could if it had conscription. We could send more under those circumstances. So Billy Hughes, in order to defend Australia from the Japanese, agrees to support conscription for overseas service for Australians. Once he gets back to Australia, of course, he can't say this outright because it will offend the Japanese, who are our ally. So he has to do a whole thing in code when he's making these speeches about this thing everybody knows about but no one's game to say. The opposition then do the same thing. The opponents of conscription, they say, look, if we send all the troops out of Australia, when the Japanese come, who's going to be here to defend us? So in order to defend Australia, we have to be against conscription to keep a good body of the troops here. And this battle goes on. And the leader of the anti-conscription forces in New South Wales is constantly being censored or his speech is suppressed because he keeps referring to Japan as this possible danger and why we must vote no. I mean, he'd actually led the voluntary recruitment campaign. He resigns from that to take up the leadership of the anti-conscription campaign, and his reasons on both occasions were to keep British power up in the Pacific, to keep the Japanese down. So the whole conscription debate is really a debate about how to cope with this dilemma about our friends, the Japanese.
During the war, Australian exports of raw materials to Japan doubled as Japan's industrial base expanded. Taking advantage of disruption in supplies from Europe to gain a greater share of the market, Japan increased its exports to Australia nearly tenfold. By 1918, Japan's Big Seven had taken over from British hands the commodity trade between Australia and Japan.
The war was a wonderful war for Japan. The Japanese pursued their own interests in a Pacific and East Asian region from which the other powers were temporarily absent. So Japan established a close to hegemonic position in China, a very powerful position in the Pacific, and by the end of the war, the Japanese were they had also gained financially as a result of the war. They supplied weapons and munitions and so on to the Allies. So at the end of the war, the two countries which had done very well, of course, out of the war were Japan and the United States. And in a sense, that First World War ushered in the beginnings of the long struggle for Pacific hegemony between Japan and the United States, which in a sense continues right until our time.
It was Paris in the spring, and there was hope in the air. The eyes of the world were focused on the Palace of Versailles. The business at hand was the treaty to end World War I. They decided it must never happen again.
Japan wanted to have in the Charter of the League of Nations that was then being drawn up a clause that ruled out racial discrimination. They believed that they were the equal of the Europeans, and therefore that discrimination against them anywhere in the world was improper. They faced the fierce opposition of Billy Hughes, the Australian Prime Minister, and that, of course, meant the imperial interest, the British imperial interests. And it was largely due to the very fierce pressure exerted by Billy Hughes that Japanese attempt to write into the new League of Nations a clause outlawing racial discrimination was defeated. The Japanese were very aggrieved by that. They didn't really understand Hughes. They saw him as, indeed, one of the Japanese referred to the Australian Prime Minister Hughes as a peasant. A peasant meaning ignorant backwoodsman who really didn't understand the world, but nevertheless had this strange importance in the British imperial context. Why was this colonial figure from remote Australia given any weight in determining British policy?
Efforts failed in 1920 to renew the Anglo-Japanese Defence Treaty. The crucial alignment of interests between the Empire and Japan was now permanently ruptured and was increasingly to be replaced by a fierce commercial competition into which Australia inevitably was drawn.
In the 30s, the hostility of the Americans and the Western countries generally backing them to Japan's unilateral military campaigns in China led to Japan walking out of the League of Nations in 1932 and entering upon the path of diplomatic isolation. And that diplomatic isolation was accompanied by severe economic pressures that were brought to bear.
When, in 1930, Britain's textile exports were hit by plummeting world prices, it slammed the door on Japanese product going into the lucrative Indian and colonial markets. And the Ottawa Conference of 1932 implemented an empire preference policy, which further disadvantaged the Japanese. Despite its developing trade with Japan, Australia became a loyal partner in the imperial scheme.
When the Depression comes, what the British Empire and other powers decide to do is to tighten their own trade, to make sure that all the trade that is going on between the British countries is actually confined to those countries. So you can then strengthen yourself by beggaring your neighbours. And the Ottawa Agreement in 1932 is an attempt to re-establish, bring the chicks back in to the British now. Because by now Canada has really been integrated into the North American economy rather than into the British imperial economy. So that all this Canadian trade is being dissipated away from Australia and Great Britain. So there's an attempt to do this. Australia gets involved in this because it wants the benefits, but it realises that the world is changing. And so it doesn't go fully along with what the British want. The British can only set the kind of dynamics afoot. They can't actually sort of stand over us and say, you must sell all of this to us and buy it on these terms. You know, I mean, Australia works very hard, because it has to protect its own exports and to diversify some of its imports. It would like to do everything with Britain. I mean, nothing would make them happier than if it could go back to this old world, but it's simply not possible.
And yet, at a dinner given by the Australian Association of British Manufacturers, guests were told by the Under-Secretary for the Dominions that there is a higher purpose in the association of the British peoples than the promotion of their own material well-being. We have always been the servants of a greater cause than that.
As the British Empire and the United States respectively faced the combined challenges of the economic depression and a rising Japanese economic threat, they both responded by raising tariff barriers against Japanese goods. And the Japanese felt very bitterly that they were being made a scapegoat for a collapse of the international order. And what the Japanese then came to think of as necessary from the early 30s was an autonomous Japanese-dominated sphere. In other words, the international order has collapsed. The international economic order has no place for us. And if the only place that the West is prepared to allow us is a subordinate, dependent role, then we can't accept that.
In a Japan increasingly commercially isolated, militarism had been gaining the upper hand. In 1931, The Japanese army had marched into Manchuria. Britain and the League of Nations condemned the invasion. But in Australia, the Lyons government quietly welcomed it, confiding to the Americans that, with British naval strength reduced, there is no policy open to Australia other than to try to be friendly with Japan, and to rejoice every time Japan advances more deeply into Manchuria and North China. The uniforms worn by Japanese troops in Manchuria were made of Australian wool. Its economy stimulated by this military adventurism, Japan was, by the mid-30s, now taking 10% of Australia's total exports, and was its second biggest customer after Britain and the Empire.
Australia's experience in the 30s would have been far worse than it was if it hadn't been for the Japanese buying our wool to equip their armies invading China. I mean, we had a very ambiguous attitude towards Japanese aggression throughout China. We didn't like it, but as long as they were being bogged down in China, that was better than they're coming south and perhaps attacking us.
I introduce to you in the first place...
Hoping to further increase this Asian trade, in 1934 the Minister for External Affairs, John Latham, embarked on a goodwill tour.
And Mr. Murai, the Consul General for Japan. I believe our future will largely be determined by our relations with the great countries to the north of Australia, the Netherlands, East Indies, China and Japan. I go to visit these countries and also to visit Singapore, French Cochin-China, Hong Kong and the Philippines. The object will be to show to them that Australia desires to foster, to maintain, to extend the friendship that already exists between us.
I wish to extend to you, Honorable Mr. Latham, the hearty welcome to come to our country.
I know that all will combine to extend the most hearty welcome to Mr. Latham and his staff.
I hope every success to the mission and a very pleasant trip to you.
The Japanese were quite warm and suggesting to them that, look, we can do a deal. I mean, there is really no fundamental contradiction between our interests. As Japan was fastest in emerging out of the Depression through its military and imperial expansionist path in the early 30s, there was the potential for, a theoretical potential only, really, for Australia to become part of that Japanese sphere as a supplier of raw materials and resources. But of course it was an absurd, given the dominant thinking in Australia at that time towards the mother country. I mean, it was absurd to imagine that Australia might have broken free at that time.
The Japanese responded to the Latham initiative by sending in 1935 a commercial delegation, complete with a visiting fleet.
I bring a message of goodwill from the people of Japan to the people of Australia and New Zealand.
Australia, under strong British pressure, offered nothing. When, in 1936, the Lyons government abruptly abandoned any pretense of goodwill and, to appease Manchester, slapped punitive tariffs on the highly competitive Japanese textiles, injury was added to insult.
In 1936, under pressure from British cotton manufacturers and woolen manufacturers, in the clothing industry, they say, look, we could buy more of your raw materials if you bought more of our manufactured goods. And they say, look, you don't need to buy stuff from the Japanese. You've got that as a captive market. The Japanese can't go anywhere else. Where else are they going to get wool? I mean, it's just not possible. I mean, you've got that. You don't have to buy their stuff in order to get them to buy yours. If you buy our manufactured goods, you won't lose anything from the Japanese market. So with all of these arguments going around, the Australian government in 1936 attempts to play one end against the other, to play the Japanese off against the Japanese importers off against the British exporters. What we discover, of course, to our great horror, is that the Japanese are prepared to do without us.
By the time the Australian government realized its mistake, it was too late. Japan, now on a stringent war economy footing, was surging down through China and was wary of any dependence on Australian raw materials. Europe, too, was moving inexorably towards a condition of general warfare, and there was now no Anglo-Japanese treaty in place to prevent Nazi Germany from linking up with Japan's militarist expansionism. An isolationist United States appeared little interested in the Western Pacific. While Chinese were fleeing in front of Japan's southern advance, Australians focused myopically on the struggle in Europe. China was alien and expendable, but war in Europe might withdraw Britannia's navy, even from Singapore. Hastily, Australia geared up its defence industries. It was only at this late stage that Japanese-financed British mining ventures in Western Australia, intended to supply pig iron for Japanese armaments, were finally halted. But export of scrap metal was still going on until 1938, when wharfies, alert to the form in which it might return, finally refused to load anymore. Like Australia, Attorney General Menzies found himself trapped between a decaying European empire and a rising Asian one. Ardent imperialist though he was, in a final, futile gesture of appeasement to Japan, he forced the Unionists to load the iron. But the vast trade with Japan had withered away. In 1941, under the Trading with the Enemy Act, all commerce with Japan was outlawed.
A halt has been called. Force has had to be resorted to check the march of force. Honest dealing, the peaceful adjustment of differences, the rights of independent people to live their own lives, the honouring of international obligations and promises, all these things are at stake. There never was any doubt as to where Great Britain stood in relation to them. There can be no doubt that where Great Britain stands, there stand the people of the entire British world.
Between Japan and Australia there was now no goodwill. No imperial military alliance. And no trade. When, in 1942, the Japanese swarmed in the sky over Darwin, the great Australian nightmare was finally realized.